Penguin Random House Audio presents The Red Lotus, a novel by Bohjalian, read for you by Rebecca Lowman. Redemption? Sure. But in the end, he's just another dead rat in a garbage pail behind a Chinese restaurant. Wes Anderson and Noah Baumbach, Mr. Fantastic Fox. There can be no lotus flower without the mud. Thich Nhat Hanh. Prologue. The opposite of a hospice? Not a maternity ward or a NICU. It's a trick question. The correct answer? An emergency room. In a hospice, you do everything you can to allow people to die. In the ER, you do all that you can to keep them alive. It was why she loved the ER, especially the night shift in the city, the relentlessness, the frenetic drive to keep a heart beating or to get someone breathing. Oh, sometimes you lost. You called it. You declared the suicide or the stroke victim or the accidental overdose dead. But far more often, you won. Or at least you won long enough to get the patient into the OR or into a room upstairs. You won long enough that whatever happened to the man or woman or child or toddler or, dear God, baby, was someone else's problem. And so she became a different person in the ER. She had, in fact, become a different person there. She was a tectonic recreation that was unrecognizable even to her own mother, an evolution wrought in months rather than millennia, 66 months if she was going to be precise, that had begun in her first rotation and culminated during her first July night as an attending physician. It was in the midst of the ER madness, the light and the sound, and there were just so many sounds, the human and the mechanical, the dying and the wounded, and the supportive and the scared, that she morphed into an adrenaline junkie. She was no longer a shy soul that balked at attention, a girl as wary of kindness as shelter cats with torn ears that even after adopted would shrink into the dark of the closet. She was something bigger, inexorable and unyielding. There was just so much pain and so much fear and so much incredulity in the ER. So many tales Alexis heard that began, "It's a long story," or "It happened so fast," or "You won't believe it when I tell you." And so much urgency that she could forget who she once was. In the ER, there was no chance that she might slip back into the anxiety or the despair or the self-loathing that as a teenager had her using an old-fashioned razor blade or X-Acto knife to cut deep into her thighs. To feel something other than depression or doubt, to be the captain of her own pain. She felt no need to tend to herself when she was tending to people who, at least that moment, were dramatically worse off than she was. Than she ever was, at least on the outside. She was just too busy. And so it was perhaps fitting that it was in the ER that she met him. Just as fitting was how she met him. Though he was probably in no danger of dying. It was a bullet wound, but nothing like the horrors she'd seen bullets inflict in her years in trauma bays and cubicles. The worst, and worst, was a high bar when it came to guns and emergency rooms. Were the 3 teenage girls who were shot after school at field hockey practice, by a boy, of course, for reasons that would remain forever unfathomable, because then he'd gone home and shot himself. He'd used an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle, and the girls had holes in their abdomens and chests and legs. One of the 3 was still awake, and just before she was intubated, she begged Alexis to tell her that she wasn't going to die, her voice so strong that when Alexis murmured, "No, no, shh," she believed it. She really did. One of the others had a heart that stopped beating twice as they worked, and so they gave her the paddles, and the child, and she was a child, she was 15 for fuck's sake, had lived long enough to die in the OR instead of the ER. Only one of that trio had lived, and when the last of the girls was gone from the room, Alexis had looked at the ER and how everything was awash in blood, the gloves and the gauze, the bone saw and retractors, the tubes and the tape and the trash cans, the sweatshirts and skirts the girls had been wearing, the white socks, their cleats. The floor was streaked and splattered, and the team that had striven to save them had left footprints, the soles of their surgical booties sometimes traversing the red veins left on the tile by the wheels of the gurneys. This was different. Austin's bullet wound was different. He appeared on a Saturday night, Sunday morning technically, and Alexis was very, very good with a needle, a toothed forceps, and a pair of suturing scissors. With the trauma scissors, when she began by cutting away his sleeve. She was also very good with a scalpel, and probably would have been well before medical school, which mattered, because the bullet was lodged near the largest bone in his right arm, 3 inches below the greater tuberosity of the humerus. It was a low-velocity wound, and had chipped off a piece of the bone, but it hadn't shattered it. It hadn't, thank God, ripped a hole in the brachial artery, which might have caused him to bleed out in the bar, and it hadn't shredded his rotator cuff, which might have crippled him for life. He was in pain, but not so much that he couldn't laugh at the fact that he had only been in a dive bar in the East Village because he'd left a party and his Uber app had said the nearest vehicle was 20 minutes away. So, on a lark, he'd gone into the bar to watch a couple of guys throwing darts. His smile was ironic and crooked, but far more boyish than rakish. He'd been drinking, and that certainly ameliorated the pain, too, his eyes a little more narrow than she would come to know them, but still open enough that she could see instantly the intangible spark and the tangible green. The muscles in his jaw would tense and untense as she worked, his breath beery as he grimaced like the men at the gym who would lie on a bench and press 300 pounds up off their chests. He had what she would eventually come to learn was a biker's body. Slender, but a strong, solid core, and legs that were unexpectedly muscled. His hair was black coffee dark. He and another dart player had taken a cab the 20 blocks north on First Avenue to the hospital, where, of all things, it would turn out he worked too. The two of them hadn't waited for an ambulance, and they hadn't waited for the cops. The guy who'd fired the shot? Some crazy junkie, homeless, they presumed, who had run from the bar like a madman. No, he was a madman, when he realized that he'd actually discharged his crappy little handgun. Some ridiculous Remington pocket pistol. "What do you do here?" she asked as she treated him. "At the hospital." And he told her. He told her that he worked directly for the hospital's chief development officer. He raised money. He worked with the folks who managed the hospital's money. They laughed about meeting here rather than, say, in the hospital cafeteria or on the promenade along the East River as she removed the bullet and stitched him up. And then as they sat in the ER cubicle behind the thick blue drapes and waited for the police to arrive so he could tell them what happened. He guessed that they were probably still at the bar interviewing the bartenders and anyone willing to stick around after someone had nearly killed some yuppie dart player at 1 a.m. She asked him about the Band-Aids on the fingers on his left hand. He admitted, sheepishly, that he'd been bitten by a cat the day before. It had been in some woman's lap in the bakery where he was getting a scone and a cup of coffee, and he startled it when he went to pet it as he was leaving. Flirting with the woman? She'd asked him, which was, in truth, flirting itself. "Nope, just surprised to see a cat. The animal was sitting up in one of those cat carriers." She insisted on removing the 3 bandages, none very big, and was startled by how deep and ugly the cuts were. She disinfected them, and they talked about rabies, and he was clear, and he was adamant. The cat was fine. And clearly the cat was fine, because it had been nearly 7 months ago now that he had taken a cab that night to the hospital. If that cat had had rabies, he would have been long dead. Still, she'd cleaned the wounds herself, applied an antibiotic ointment, and added a prescription for Augmentin. Meanwhile, his new friend, acquaintance really, had sat outside in the bright lights of the ER waiting room, stewing, and seemed far more annoyed than scared that there was a guy in a cubicle with a bullet in his biceps. She attended to other patients as they waited for the police, pulling on and off the...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?